So let me just say that it's an honor for me to introduce Mr. Jeff Hammer, as it is with all the speakers. Because what you see here with each speaker is a reflection, as the great Apostle Paul says, it's the body of Christ, right? The nonprofit world is really an extension, in many ways, of the church. And each of these nonprofit organizations has a unique ministry and purpose. And the same thing, obviously, in these set of speakers. Each of these disciplines is very, very important to the overall success of the nonprofit organization. That's one of the things that we teach in terms of servant leadership, is that what servant leaders do is that they understand that success is never, ever, ever the result of one person.
Right.
It's always the team. It's always the team. And the very best leaders understand that. And this is one of the reasons why we do these things. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if everything flows through you as a nonprofit director or board member, you may be successful in the short term, but you're not doing your organization any favor. Because what happens, what's one of the the certainties in life? Change, right? Things are going to change. And this is one of the reasons why we have Jeff come. Because just like we have to plan for our own personal changes in life circumstances, nonprofit organizations must do the same. So Mr. Jeff Hammer is a financial advisor from Richmond, Virginia, with a national practice for tailored personal, business, intellectual property, estate, and philanthropic financial planning. That's a lot of different planning. Prior to joining Northwestern, Jeff led aircraft engine and helicopter business units. We should talk about that too. It sounds like very important stuff. And over $600 million in annual sales. That's a lot of money. Along with multifunctional strategy teams and national IT systems development and implementation programs for the world's largest logistic enterprise. That's right, the Defense Logistics Agency. He later led multiple company-wide merger and acquisition initiatives and IT departments that supported 50 million customers, that's a lot of customers, and 40 billion risk portfolios across 25 business lines from one of the country's top five banks, Capital One. So without further ado, Mr. Jeff Hammer, come on up.
All right.
All right, well, I do tend to be somewhat mobile, so is this good?
Yep. Oh, you'll turn it on.
All right.
He'll turn it on for you.
All right, we're good now?
Here we go.
All right, awesome, thank you. Well, yes, my last name actually is Hammer. I do have to kind of clarify that with everyone. And actually, a couple years ago, I had one of the highlights of my life. I actually got asked to serve as the Master of Ceremonies as an event. And so I got introduced as MC Hammer. So life hack fulfillment, I said, one of my big check boxes is done. But no, there are no parachute pants. I will spare you that exercise. Exactly. There you go. But yeah, well, what we're going to be talking about is taking a look at starting off with a couple of different presentations. And one of the joys of being in a highly regulated industry is that we have to separate them into two. But we'll touch on that. But first of all, as we take a look at the planned giving strategy, then make sure we've got this. You've seen me. Part of what we do is when we have conversations with folks and organizations, because we do business and nonprofit and personal planning, as we take a look at that, we want to make sure we understand where someone's coming from. And so we want to, back to what Danielle was just saying, we want to ask those questions. What is your story? What is that makes your story unique? I know I've had some conversations with Jill, Ramona, and some others, and as we've had that, that's where we typically have started those conversations. I want to know why you're here. What brings you to this point? Because any good financial plan actually does not start with the financials. That sounds like maybe a reverse way of thinking, but the reason that doesn't start there is until we know where you're going, there may be ways to show you a more efficient way to get there. And oftentimes we can find ways that may get you to your destination 30 to 70% more efficiently once we know where it is you're aiming for. And so that's where we want to take a look at that and find out where is it you want to go. So we take a look at that and we look at the bottom of that list there, you'll see risk management. And And that's the defensive part of financial planning. So when we have those conversations with folks as individuals, we want to find out, have they taken the appropriate steps in place? And the reason that that matters, whether it's an individual or whether it's an organization like yours, is we want to find out what happens if, God forbid, somebody does not come home one day. What happens if someone becomes incapacitated? What happens if there's a significant tax event, a significant death event, a long-term health event? We want to plan for those kinds of things and say, how do we shift that risk away to the best degree possible? So that's part of what we're going to be looking at in that defensive planning. Now we also take a look at asset accumulation. So what is it you're saving for? What are those major objectives that matter to you? So it may be saving for retirement, it may be saving for the expansion of your nonprofit, it may be saving for a lot of different things. Well, once we know what you're aiming for, again, there may be more efficient ways to get there. Now another piece that we also spend a lot of time on is the asset distribution piece. And Richard actually just touched on this a minute ago. For a nonprofit organization, we may be looking at it and say, okay, how long do we need these funds to last? And in this case, they were looking at building an endowment that was going to need it to last generations. And that is going to be one of the top questions a lot of donors are going to look at and say, will your organization be here 2 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And they're going to want to see that stability. So, or what is it that's going to propel you there? So we look at that as well, and as we also look at that with the asset distribution piece, the other things that we're going to be looking at is when a conversation with an individual donor, is that's where a lot of times their legacy interest starts to surface. They may be saying, we're going to have some funds that can become available sooner or later. In some cases, we've seen a decent amount of sooner. Reason being is there's $33 trillion that is going to change hands over the next decade as baby boomers start to transition their wealth to their next generations. That's 33 trillion with a T.
Ooh.
It's a massive opportunity. And so as we have conversations with folks, we want to find out what is it that matters to you, where may you want to give. We also do business planning as well. And believe it or not, that may actually have impacts into your planned giving as well. Because let's say, for example, there's a privately held company. And so let's say Ramona's got her own business, and she decides at some point she's going to sell the business. But what she would like to do is, right before she sells it, she'd like to make some charitable gifts out of that. She may choose to give away some privately held stock that doesn't have voting rights and give it to, please tell me your name one more time. Was it?
Nicola.
Nicola, okay. She may choose to give that to Nicola's organization and say, that's an opportunity for me to give that away. Now, Nicola doesn't have a vote in running the business going forward, but she does get income off the dividends that are generated from that gift of stock. So that may be part of someone's exit strategy, especially as we look at the number of folks that are going to be transitioning their business over the next 10 years. Well, and lastly, as Danielle was talking about and several other folks have talked about, is beginning to that creativity. It's something that we came across. It's something that you hear a lot about. If you're familiar with the group DARPA in the Department of Defense, they do a lot of advanced research projects. And that is sort of one of their mantras as well, is embrace the ambiguity. Because there is an awful lot of opportunity there. And that's how we tend to view it, is in that ambiguity, there may be an awful lot of creative space that you just haven't seen yet. And that's what we've tended to find is, where's that creative space? And if there is some kind of a downturn that's coming in giving, hopefully it's more on the 4% side.
That's right, yeah.
But if it's not, then what really is going to become more and more important is what we'll see in this planned gift box, is how do you get gift multipliers? And that is a transformational conversation with a donor, because most donors are used to looking at an organization and saying, if we get 80 or 90 cents out of every dollar towards the end purpose, that's a pretty well-run organization. Well, we want to shift that conversation and say, what if we could get $5 to $15 worth of impact off of every dollar that's given? Now you have a very interested donor, because they're just as curious as anybody else has seen their dollar go as far as possible. So we want to have a lot more of those conversations, which then that can also solve more of any funding shortfalls that may become there as well. So that's what we're looking at there. Now, as we take a look at some of the questions that come up with a donor, is some of the first things that a donor is going to look at is they're going to want to, first of all, understand why give to you versus anyone else. And this comes back to understanding your story again. What is your vision for that organization? And the more compelling you can make that, that's going to be the thing that's going to cut through the noise for a donor, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But part of the reason that we want to look at that is because let's say you have an opportunity to get in front of a transformational donor. That transformational donor is going to want to see a transformational impact for their gift. They want to understand that you have a vision for this. And so, for example, one organization that we've done some work with in the nearby area, they have a vision for impacting 25,000 at-risk seniors, and they've identified where those folks live. They've got a vision for how they're going to impact that through some outreach services. You know, we have a school that I'll show you an example of. They have a very clear vision statement of what it is that they want to do, and they're in the middle of enabling a massive transformational gift while they're working out of the back of a church. We'll talk more about that. But that donor, especially that donor who has that capability to write that transformational gift, that check, those donors, again, they're going to be looking for that transformational impact. And so as we look at that, what they're going to want to see is, they're getting approached by 1,000, 2,000 donor requests every year. I mean, so why do they give it to you versus St. Jude's versus, you know, their church versus some other organization? So we need to cut through that noise and say why you stand out. So, and as a result of that, that also gets back to some of the marketing strategies that were mentioned earlier, is they may not have familiarity with what your organization does. So it's a matter of how do we create that very incisive statement that gets their attention quickly. And again, we talked about they're going to be worried about how efficiently their dollar is going to be used. Well, you on the nonprofit side of things, you are going to be worried about some of the things that Danielle was just mentioning. And as Lily and I were talking earlier, there's that whole question of how do you manage that cash flow of saying we got to keep today's lights on today, much less worry about where we're going to be 5, 10 years from now. So there's that balance that has to be struck there. And then as well as we also look at that, then some of the things we're going to see are really around how to differentiate that, but also taking a look at your gift acceptance flexibility. Now again, as one of those exercises that you'll want to go through is really understanding what kinds of gifts will you take and what kinds of gifts will you not take. And a lot of times, most organizations will kind of set that threshold of saying, we'll take a gift of cash, we may take a gift of appreciated stock. Beyond that, maybe starting to get outside of our wheelhouse of where we're comfortable. Well, the reality there is if there's that flexibility to say we can take on more gifts and more gift types, there may be a lot more that can be done. But now you're strapped as far as your resources, so how do you solve that? Well, what we do, goes back to Gary's comment, as far as having the team. Who are those folks that you can bring to the table that can handle some very creative gift opportunities? Because nobody wants that gift of radioactive swampland, and there are folks who will try to give that to you. But in other cases, we've had some incredibly unique gifts that folks have given. We've had one case, somebody gave a couple $1 million worth of Chinese art, and this organization was trying to figure out what do we do with this? How do we actually handle that? We had someone else have 183 hectares of Brazilian rubber trees in the Amazon that we needed to get an appraisal on from the Brazilian government to make sure it was legit. Now, there are unique gifts out there. There's another gift we're working on right now with a patent inventor, or it may be a $38 million gift that we think we can generate $200 million of impact off of. You just never know where these are going to come from. And again, that particular gift is one that's going to a school that is working out of the back of a church. And part of how they were able to get that attention was they had a very transformational vision of what they could do. And so we're going to touch on that. So as we take a look at that, the approach that we take is we want to make sure that folks have that opportunity to be educated on what are some of the different ways that folks may be able to give. And so how do we look beyond that gift of cash or appreciated stock? But that case statement is something that's going to be impactful as well. So back to, again, Danielle's point of telling your story. And so what I wanted to do here for a second is switch over and show you a sample case statement. Okay. So this is one for this particular school that I mentioned that was working out of the back of a church. They had a very clear vision, and as a result, they had an opportunity to get in front of someone and talk about what they wanted to do. The school was put in motion about 15 years ago, roughly, and they already have had some merit scholars come through the school. They performed in the top 20% in some national testing. They're one of 11 schools in the country that has already been invited to what's called an exemplary program through an accrediting organization. They have a very compelling story, and what they want to do is they want to take this model and take it not just for their local community, but take it around the world. And You just don't know where these donors are going to come from. This particular donor that surfaced, totally by happenstance or by divine orchestration, one of the two, was sitting on the plane next to the head of school, and they got stuck on the runway in Atlanta for 2 hours and couldn't move, and so they got a chance to talk. This guy ended up having no heirs. He and his wife have made more than enough. He had a product that was projected to make $38 million on the first contract alone, and there's 3 other contracts maybe coming behind it. And we think on the first one, we can, off the patent's income off of that, we can get $200 million of impact. You just don't know. And one of the things we've also done every year for the last 7 years as we looked at our practice, we have looked individually and said, where have our top clients come from? And pretty consistently, 4 out of our top 10 clients have come from directions we never saw coming. One of those, for example, I had a young man, he was 25 years old, and for whatever reason we had just hit it off well. He's had every challenge in life that you can imagine, but he is an overcomer. He's one of those guys who's always reading a book, and he's got the best book recommendations. And so we go clog the arteries together at IHOP about every 6 months, and then he shares what he's been learning. But we debated for 1.5 years about whether or not he should spend $10 a month to get a term insurance policy to protect his family, and just in case if anything happened to him. $10 a month, less than a movie ticket. And he debated me. Then he finally decided he was going to go ahead and do it. And then right after that, he introduced me to his brother-in-law who played for the Jacksonville Jaguars. You just don't know. And again, every year we've seen about 40% of our biggest opportunities come from places we just never saw coming. So you don't know. So that's why it's worthwhile to have that compelling story. But also part of this case statement, as we look at that, is this gets into what is the actual need. And so in this case, this organization had a need for some property development. And so we've identified, what was that going to look like, what kinds of skill sets were going to be needed. And in this case, we also identified they had a need for some athletic facilities, expanding the school so that it could support, back to Danielle's point earlier as well, what is the income impact of this? In this case, they were going to be able to support a couple of hundred more students and have those same kinds of results. It starts to make it quantifiable so folks can see the difference. Now the reason that this matters is this case statement is going to be a one-pager that if you have 30 to 60 seconds in front of someone, you have that opportunity to say, why should they care? And the reality here is this is not necessarily the kind of thing that you shotgun out and do as we did at Capital One. Don't blame me, I didn't send the mail. But when Capital One would do a campaign, they would send millions and millions of letters out with the prospect of saying, if we get a 0.25% response rate, so 1 out of 400, this is going to be a profitable campaign. As a nonprofit, you don't have that kind of size and scale, nor the opportunity to have that kind of waste to say we can afford that. So what we want to do is similarly to how I look at it, if I told you I was looking for a car today, where would you start? Venus, what would you tell me what to look for?
Where would you start? Where would you look for it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A car dealership or online and stuff online.
Yeah. So you tell me to look at a car dealership or look online, but you really have no idea what I'm looking for, do you?
No.
Right. I haven't given you enough to go on. And that's the same thing what happens with a lot of nonprofit organizations, is they just say, the need is great, please give. Well, everybody's need is great. So why should they give to you? But now if I come back and I tell you, Venus, I am looking for a red Corvette. Could you help me find one?
I got one.
You got one. Yeah, and so that's the thing. And all of a sudden, now we've narrowed that scope down from one of the thousands of cars I could be looking at to now I'm looking for a red Corvette. Now all of a sudden you start seeing red Corvettes everywhere.
That's exactly right. You do.
Exactly. And so that's what we want to do with these kinds of requests is you want to find that alignment with that strategic donor to say, why should we care? So now in this case, I'm going to switch over to this other document, is when we get to that point of doing a case statement, we then get to the idea of doing a, it's called a donor map. Now this very much looks like a spider web, and let me see if I can zoom in here. Yeah, here we go. So in this particular case, this organization cared about Christian education. And so one of the things that we went through and identified was, okay, well, who do we have in the alumni group? Who do we have that's already a fan of this? Where are some other folks that have already given grants? Where do we have other organizations that care? Who are the parents of kids here? They had a need for athletic equipment. So as you'll see here, we started mapping out who do we know. So there's a couple of professional athletes, a couple of professional sports teams that the organization had a connection to. Similarly, they had a need for property development, so we started to sketch that out. Who do we know that has these kinds of skill sets and capabilities? We're looking for what is that red Corvette? Why would they care? Let's find them in their sweet spot, not in ours. So now there's a natural gravitation toward it. In addition, as was talked about earlier, this was something where we looked at it and found individuals, so back to the creativity, there are a lot of companies, bigger companies out there that are going to have matching gift programs. So if you can find those matching gift programs, they may say, look, if you as an employee give $500, we'll match that $500. Combined federal campaigns. So if you work for a federal government, you can get your nonprofit listed in the combined federal campaigns. You are now eligible for somebody to designate payroll deductions to come to your organization. Lots of different ways that can be done. But one of the things we also found was this particular inventor who just was drawn, he had no connection to the school whatsoever. He was from Atlanta. And as we looked at it, he just was captured by the vision. And he was an impact donor is what we would call him. And so that impact donor, as we looked at it, we would come through and say, okay, so who else does he know? If he believes this much in it that he's willing to give $38 million, there's probably some folks around him that might care as well. And sure enough, he introduced 4 other patent holders who said, we had no idea that we could give our patent rights. We'll take a look at that as well. We have similar values and vision. We'd love to be able to make a difference in the world as well. So there may be another $8 million coming in that we think we can get $60 million of impact off of. You just don't know. So, but that's the idea. And what we found here as well was in this particular case, the idea is to start with who's already in that circle that you already know, but also who may be one phone call removed. And since we've started doing this since the beginning of the year, we've had organizations get introductions to 6 billionaires that they had no idea they were one phone call away from. And it's just an interesting cross-section of being able to say, you know, Jill and some of her friends, for example, we get them in a room and say, who do you know, who do you know? Who might care about this? Who can tie back to that case statement that's going to care? And all of a sudden you start getting this cross-pollination of, well, Jill knows somebody and Richard knows somebody who knows that person. We could get to them. It's worth a shot. We just don't know. So that's the idea here, is as we look at this, and this is where some of that creativity starts to come in and say, where might we have this opportunity? Oh, and I'll mention this as a quick example. So back to the creativity and some of the collaboration that was mentioned earlier, Richard, you were talking about it, is we had an individual who had some significant wealth. And this individual, though, had no connection to this organization. It was a school. And so as we started talking to this school, they said, we'd love to get in front of them, but we just don't know how we're going to get that opportunity. Well, as we did some research on the donor, we found out he had a tremendous passion for solving and funding cancer research. And so we said, well, there's another organization that we might be able to collaborate with. An organization we're doing some work with that actually works with pediatric cancer. And not only pediatric cancer for the kids themselves, but also their siblings who oftentimes may get lost in just the focus need that has to be there at that point in time. So we said, what if we build a collaboration between this childhood cancer organization and the school? And we approached this gentleman and say, would you like to fund some scholarships to help these kids stay on path? And it was one of those things, it was a great collaboration opportunity. Now all of a sudden, this school is on the radar of this billionaire to be able to say, he can support 2 things that he loves, the kids and the families that are impacted by this. So that's where we look at some of this creativity and say there's always a way. So back to the presentation. So as we look at this, one of the things I skipped over and I meant to touch on it was part of what we want to do in this exercise as well as with the nonprofit is really learn some of the details around those specific donors. So why should they care? What's going to be their draw? And so for some folks it is going to be that they're tax motivated. But in other cases, what we see, at least anecdotally at this point, we see that the majority of givers are impact givers. They're giving just because they care about your organization. They're giving because they care about veterans. You know, they're giving because they care about what you want to do with at-risk youth who need some counseling. They're going to be there. They're going to be the folks who show up at every event just because they love what you're doing. In other cases, you're going to have folks that may be legacy givers. So let's say, for example, you know, there's a group of folks that are caretakers. So Ramon is in your particular case. And let's say, you know, these are 2nd, 3rd generation nurses, and they look at that and say, this is just who we are. we care about this. We want to be able to give back. They're going to be a legacy donor. In other cases, we may look at it and say, I have some folks that are in my circle, and they're looking at it saying, I'm taking care of extended family. I don't know that I'm going to have that capability to give, but I'd like to. Well, what we can do there is we can create what's called an income giver. And what that means is that individual may not have the capability to give now, but if they can get an income stream back right now, they could be a future giver, as long as we can give that guarantee and saying you can get income right now to cover your daily living needs right now. So that's another type of giver. We also have folks that we would look at, we would call them identity givers. And so, for example, there are those folks, we know who they are. If there's an event, they're going to show up because they want their picture on the front of the magazine or the website. Nothing wrong with that. Their money spends just as well as anybody else's. And so it's an opportunity as well, but just knowing what's going to be their motivator. And so as we look at that, again, you have these different types of givers, and the approach is going to be slightly different for each of them. So let's say, for example, I go up to an identity giver. My request is going to be, we appreciate so much everything you've done. Wouldn't you like to be seen bringing 20 folks to the table to help impact this particular cause? That is right up the alley of an identity giver. If I'm looking at somebody who is an impact giver, however, I'm going to say, look, you've been a fantastic giver so far. Would you love to find out how you can impact 15 people for the same contribution you've been making that's right now impacting one? You'd be all over that. And it's a different way of making the request. So just finding what their motivation is. So that's what we're looking at there as we go through some of the different components there. So as we looked at that, then we talked about some of the donor mapping, and then we've talked about some of the solution creation as well, and then gift structuring. And also there's that capability to do asset management and then corporate trustee services as well. So we've already heard some of the stats here, but right now it's now over 400 billion that's being given. We'll see what the new numbers are, but one of the things that you'll see here is just with the blue and the green. The blue is are donations that are being given by individuals. Green are going to be the bequest, also coming from individuals at their passing. So roughly about 80% of dollars are coming from individuals. Now again, I fully agree with the fact, find the grants, find the opportunities in the community, find those foundations as well. But the bulk of the dollars are going to be with individuals, especially with a lot of it changing hands soon. And so as we talk with an individual donor, then what that conversation really looks like is to find out what their vision is, why do they care? We also want to find out what the nature of their gifts are. So as they start to tell their story, it's not unusual for them to start to unpack more of their personal details. Well, I've got a business, or I've got timber rights, or I've got this, or I've got that. Now all of a sudden, it gives us insight, because most of the time, and I would say 9 times out of 10 when we sit down with a donor, their first idea for a gift is probably not their most impactful. And so if we can find out more about it, we can probably show them a way to get a multiplier off of the gift. And we also want to find out what is their duration for the gift. So is it something they want to do once? Is it something they want to be the Rockefellers and be multi-generational? Is it a recurring annual gift? What do they want to do? And then as well, we also want to take a look at it and find out, do they need income? Do we work with their various advisors, so accountants, lawyers, et cetera, to find out what kind of strategies are already in place. We want to make sure that we're removing every barrier we can for the donor. Because the last thing you want to do is say, well, you as a donor, you've had a conversation with me, now I'm going to send you off to go talk to your accountant. Well, then after that, you need to go talk to your attorney. Well, now all of a sudden, I put you in the position of, like, if I go to my doctors, I don't want to be the person that's telling my cardiologist, here's what the neurologist said. That's not my capacity, it's just one more hurdle for me. We want to remove hurdles as much as we can, so we try to get those folks into the same conversation, so the donor only has to have that conversation once or twice. And so as we take a look at that, then we'll also, again, we have a unique network of folks that we actually work with around the country to handle some of these more unique kinds of gifts, opportunities. Now some things we'll talk through today are just some different scenarios. And so for example, one of these is a gift of life insurance. There's a couple different ways this can be done. This can be created with a new issuance of a policy. But I'll oftentimes find that there were folks out there who may have some old policies out there that really were put in place decades ago and may not have the same need for those. So case in point, I have 3 kids right now. That should be 3 kids ever. But I have 3 kids as we look at that. As we look at that, then what we would see there is I had a lot of insurance just to cover that. So if I didn't come home one day, I can fulfill a promise that I made to my wife and my kids that, I want to make sure they can go to college. Well, all three of them are in college now, so I'm starting to count down. Starting to get some bigger smiles on my face as two of them are in their junior year. And as soon as both of them graduate, I'm dropping a lot of my insurance because that need has been met. So, but in that particular case, there are folks out there who have these old policies sitting around and they needed, $300,000, $1 million, whatever it was, but they don't have that same need anymore. And so it's just sitting out there. Well, with a simple one-page form and a signature, they can change that to be the beneficiary hand of your organization or to be a partial beneficiary. So there's these opportunities to do that. But one of the things we would see here, this is an example of one that we had done. And as we looked at this, we had an organization that had some donors. Every organization tends to have this circle of donors that's giving at some level. And so in this case, these folks were giving at a $5,000 a year level. It's a nice gift to have. But part of what we started with those folks is say, you've been doing this for 25 years on average. Would you like to be able to give one more time, not only to solve the operational needs with your regular $5,000 gift, but to have that strategic leap forward to make sure this organization is thriving for decades to come? So as I had that conversation, we said, what if you had another $5,000 on top of that? Well, in your tax bracket, it's deductible for most of these folks. And so now, as a result, they're paying about $3,000 a year with the tax write-off. So it's about $250 a month, doable for these folks. Now, we also talked to it and said, okay, so what if we took that and routed that into a life insurance policy? So let's say, for example, is it Alice, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's say it's Alice, it's your organization. So I'm willing to be a donor, and I send you a check. And I say, here's my $5,000 check, and I authorize you to write a life insurance policy on me. So if I die tomorrow, for the purchase price of $5,000, which feels like $3,000 after I get a tax write-off, you're now a $250,000 recipient of my life insurance policy. It's a pretty good multiplier. Now, in my case, I'm hoping I live a little longer than that. I'm partial to that. So in this particular case, let's say, for example, we've routed it into this life insurance policy, but because I'm sending you the check, you can send me a tax letter back saying it's deductible. And then, but you also now have ownership of the policy, which means that with a whole life insurance policy, those policies can be building cash value as like a savings component inside of it, and they can also be spinning up dividends as well. So now, you own the policy. That gives you the rights to say, if I want to access the cash value, I can. If I want to access the dividends, I can. So in this particular example, let's say we had 20 folks who decided to do this. Overnight, there's a $2.5 million life insurance benefit from all of those. In this case, we had 20, we had a $5 million life insurance gift that could be coming to the organization. Now, if we go out 30 years, that death benefit will roughly double. So now looking at what could be a $10 million gift coming in from those 20 different policy holders. And then also, as we look at this, they've been able to basically, after the tax write-off, get about a 6.5 times increase off of their gift in raw dollars. Now, if you discount it, it's a little less, but we won't get into the math of that. It's too late in the afternoon. But as we look at that, let's say each of these policies now has built up a cash value of $150,000. Well, across 20 policies, Alice now has access to $3 million of cash value that she can use. So if you talk about having those swings in the income, from one year to the next, and you're in one of those desert periods, this can be a great place where you pull it from. In some cases, there's a handful of companies who do this really, really well. Banks love the cash value in some of these policies because it's AAA rated money. There's only a couple of places they can get that. And so as a result, you may say, I don't want to pull the cash out, but I want to borrow against it. You now have the flexibility of using this as collateral. It's a unique opportunity. And then lastly, in this case, we had this spinning off about $4,500 a year in dividends off of each policy. What could an organization do with 20 policies like that that had $90,000 a year coming in? Does that give you a predictable income stream? And then later on a death benefit. Lots of different ways you can do this. It's a bit of a Swiss Army knife as far as a giving vehicle goes. Used a lot of different ways. I'll pause for a second. Questions on that?
Every church ought to be taking advantage of that.
Hmm?
Every church.
Yeah. Yeah, Carol.
Can I have a copy of all your slides?
Oh, absolutely.
This is wonderful.
Okay, sure. Sorry I missed you.
I love the thinking outside the
She's
box.
got it.
You got
Yeah.
it?
We got the different
I
one
got
here.
all of them.
There you go.
I'm good at the second.
And if there's other folks who need those, just feel free to stick up your hand. We'll make sure we get you both copies.
I love how you're thinking outside the box.
Thank you. Yeah, we have fun with this. It really does feel like it's a Rubik's Cube. Just keep turning it. There's a way. Yeah. Yes, sir.
This doesn't complicate the accounting and bookkeeping for nonprofit?
It can, but it is also one of those things of, as you look at the return on the investment there, of just saying, look, if we can get multipliers on that potential gift, it's worth an extra few minutes for the accountant. So, yeah.
So it can be considered as an asset, and thereby you can use the collateral to borrow on to go to another level, because now it's considered as an asset, you're not drawing on it, it's actually part of your statement, your financial statement.
Yeah, so Venus's question there was, is this something that can be used as an asset? And it absolutely can. So if you have the ownership of the policy, now let's say, for example, if it's a little different, if I don't give up the ownership of the policy, then you can't use it, I own it. But if I give the policy over to Alice and her organization, you can list it as an asset.
Consider it as collateral, and to go to a bank and say, I have this amount of assets in collateral, and you can borrow on, I mean, you can now say, I can purchase a building based on the collateral of that,
Mm-hmm. If you can borrow against that cash value.
Yeah, this is it.
That's right. Okay. Good questions. All right, well, we'll take a look at a second option here as well. So this is the option of a donor advised fund. And basically the idea here is, you can do these for any kind of balance here. But what we would tend to see is someone may drop some funds in and they have multiple areas that they want to give in. So they're not just interested in your area only, but they may be interested in the SPCA and again St. Jude's, and they want to have that capability to splinter their gift in multiple directions. It's better to get part of something than 100% of nothing. And so as a result of that, when we look at that, we want to make sure that you have that capability to say, we can have that kind of a gift being received from a donor advised fund. And basically what happens with a donor advised fund is someone just drops some money in, let's say it's $100,000 or $10,000 or whatever it may be. And every year, the growth off of that, they have the right to make a grant off of that, or they may not for a period of time. But typically what we see is folks get in a regular giving cycle, and they may say, you know what, let's say we've spun off $7,500 a year, we're going to give $2,500 to you, $2,500 to you, and $2,500 to you off the growth of that. So that's the kind of idea. Basically what a donor advised fund does is gives that donor flexibility to say they can go in multiple directions. Right? Now, this is the idea of what's called a charitable lead annuity trust. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's a pretty handy tool. And so as we take a look at that, this is an example. And what we're seeing here is, let's say someone has some funds that they decide to put into a charitable lead annuity trust. Now what does that actually do? The idea of a charitable lead annuity trust is this is something where someone says, I want to give, but I'm also not sure that I'm ready to hand off the money, especially to my heirs. So again, back to my kids. I have a 22-year-old, I have a 21-year-old, and then I have an 18-year-old. If my 22-year-old came into $1 million today, he would go invest it. If my 21-year-old came into $1 million today, she would give it away. And if my 18-year-old got $1 million, he'd go buy a helicopter. So as a result, I'm not sure if he's ready for the money just yet. And so one of the things we would look at there is to say, let's set the money aside, in this case maybe for 15 years. And now it's going to be spinning off some income that models some behaviors that I would hope my kids would get from watching my wife and me, to say, we want to give back. That's part of our DNA. Watch it for the next 15 years. Now ultimately, it's going to come back to you as my kids, as heirs, but in this particular case, in the meantime, it's going to do some good in the world. And when it becomes your money, 15 years down the road, we hope maybe you'll turn around and do the same thing, either with this organization or another one. But the nice thing for the receiving organization is now, let's say, for example, this is locked in an income stream for 15 years. That gives you some predictability back to your budgeting cycle. If you're the beneficiary of that charitable lead annuity trust, you can say, we got 15 years of predictable income. We're narrowing our variance from one year to the next because we know that's coming. So that can be a helpful tool. Now, charitable remainder trust. So this is a bit of the opposite of a charitable lead annuity trust. And what I mean by that is, in this case, so in the charitable lead trust we were just talking about, I want to see my gift happen during my lifetime. I don't want to have to be dead for something good to happen. In this case, a charitable remainder trust says, I need some income. I just don't feel that comfortable saying, I've got everything covered. So I may be looking at it saying, I've got an extended health event, or I'm taking care of aging parents, or special needs situation, whatever it may be. Well, in this case, I need some income for a while. But after either the period of that trust or after I pass away, there's something that's left over, the remainder interest, that comes back to your nonprofit. So again, this could be something that now becomes a future gift down the road, but solves someone's need for income right now. So that's basically how the charitable remainder trust works. Now, we heard it. Yes, sir.
In that situation, they do give the money to the nonprofit?
So what happens there is it's gifted into a trust vehicle, and with that trust vehicle, what will happen there is the nonprofit is set aside as having the remainder interest in that trust.
Okay, they don't have the money then, they get it after the person has gone away, but the charity has the trust.
They're going to be listed as having that remainder interest in the trust. So it's basically almost like the concept of being a beneficiary of the trust down the road. But yeah, what will happen there as well is, depending on the gift and how it's structured, there may be an opportunity to write that off as well as part of that interest, because in order for it to meet the federal requirements for that tax deductibility, they have to reserve at least 10% of the balance of that trust to say, no matter what, we're never depleting 100% of the trust value for our use. We're leaving at least 10% for the organization. Good question. Other questions from folks? Okay, well, the idea of an endowment's fairly straightforward. And again, as Richard was mentioning earlier, this is the kind of thing that can be built up over time, or it can be built up as a one-time gift, for example, or periodic ongoing contributions. But the idea there is, with an endowment, there's some amount of funds that is set aside and invested. And as we look at that, then what happens there is there's going to be some type of a gift agreement that's set up between the donor and the organization. And oftentimes this is going to be governed by some investment policy as well. And so this will be something that, when we talk about the idea of an investment policy, what that basically means is, how does either the donor or you as the receiving organization want those funds to be managed? Now, we've had, most organizations tend to fall more on the conservative side of things. Because I think to that point of saying, do you want to necessarily have everything swinging up 30% or down 30% if the market goes crazy? That's a risky proposition. Now, I did have one organization where the guy basically said, I'm making the donation, I'm going to treat this just like I do my personal finances, we're going to Vegas. It was basically the risk portfolio he put together. We advised strongly against it, but that's what he wanted. So, but that's what we would look at there. And typically what happens is the growth in the account is what's going to be siphoned off of the endowment every year, so that we're not depleting that principal base there that's going to be there for the long term. Now, one of the ideas here as well is, this is one where we've seen some significant spike over the last 2 or 3 years, is really this gifting of intellectual property. So as I mentioned before, we had the gentleman who's making the patent gift, but there's also some other folks that we're dealing with that are in the music industry, and some of them are local. And as we look at that, they have certain royalties that are coming in. And one of the opportunities that we really see here is with the passage of the Music Modernization Act within the last few weeks. What is expected to happen there is, because there's now going to be more traceability and accountability to where royalties should be coming in for artists, it's expected that there may be a 40% jump for these artists and songwriters in their royalty revenue, just because of the Music Modernization Act. It's a tremendous opportunity to say, is this something you'd like to do? In addition, when we talk with folks in these kinds of industries as well, we talk with them about, what is your branding? Is this something, for example, if you look at a guy like Trace Adkins, for example, he does a lot of work with Wounded Warriors. And that's one of those things, that's actually a bit of his branding. And it's a matter of saying, what do you care about? And if so, how do you give? And make that, again, part of the extension of who they are. So, but in this case, the individuals were able to give a regular recurring income stream. Part of what we were doing there is taking some of that royalty income, routing part of that into the Charitable Lead Annuity Trust, so again, we could build predictability for this organization off of their income that may be coming in off of, in this case, songs for the next 70 years. That's how long the copyright can be worked. But in other cases as well, we take a look at this and say, let's put part of that as well into a life insurance policy. So we actually splintered their intellectual property and routed it in a couple different directions. And now we're getting a couple of different multipliers on this. So we can get some income now, but also a long-term spike down the road with the life insurance death benefit. Okay. And then one of the ones that we see is also retirement accounts. And so with retirement accounts, there's multiple ways that folks can give in this particular regard. So One of those, for example, is as soon as someone turns 70 and a half, if they have a 401k, an IRA, SEP IRA, simple 403b, 457, any of those tax-deferred kinds of accounts, once they turn 70 and a half, IRS says you've waited long enough, it can't be tax-deferred any longer. You've got to take out roughly about 4% in year one and more every year thereafter. Now, some folks need this money to live on, but there are also other folks who quite honestly get angry, saying, I'm being forced to take money I don't need, and now I'm going to get taxed on it. And that's just kind of like insult to injury. And so where we have that conversation with folks like that, just to say, well, why don't you give that away? You know, if they're going to make you take $5,000 a year that you don't want, that you don't want to have to pay taxes on, give it away. Or better yet, if you give it away, why not give it away in one of these tax multiplier vehicles? Say it becomes the funding mechanism for a life insurance policy. That $5,000 made by a $200,000 life insurance policy. So, different ways that can be done. Also, folks have the capability with these types of accounts to be able to give away as much as $100,000 every year and make that as a qualified charitable distribution. And then, in this case, this is an example. We've adulterated it a little bit to keep this individual a bit anonymous. But even with the elevated estate thresholds, there are folks out there that are going to be impacted by the estate tax threshold. And one of the things that we also encourage folks to think about is whatever the current tax law is today, even when they made the estate tax changes permanent a couple years ago, one of the things we always remind folks is permanent in Washington speak means this year only, because it's subject to change. You know, you're one election cycle away, one vote away. And so as a result of that, as we look at this individual is going to have, you know, a few million, about $4 million of his estate that was going to be over the estate tax threshold. So as soon as he passed away, there's going to be an estate tax of about $1.2 million just because he died. Now, in this case, he was one of those individuals who looked at it and said, I'm just not a fan. And so, because when we have conversations with folks like that, we say you have three choices. You can give the money away, you can spend it, or you can give it to 300 million people you don't know through the estate tax. Now, so far I have yet to see anyone who's taken me up on the last option, which is say I'll give it away to 300 million people I don't know. They have other folks they care about or organizations they care about more so than just everybody else. And so what we do is in this case, we took a look at that and said, well, if there's a distribution that goes to the heirs, it's going to get the estate tax first. And in this case, these heirs also worked for him. He'd already made all the lifetime gifts he was allowed to make from a gift tax perspective. And so because these folks worked for him, they were going to have to take distributions off of that, and it's going to be treated as ordinary income for them as well. So now it's getting taxed a second time. So this individual is looking at it, out of his $5 million 401k, only about $1.2 million was going to transfer to his heirs. And he looked at that and said, I've got better ideas of what I'd like to do with that. And so he looked at that and said, give away your 401k. It sounds crazy, but he's like, I can get a sizable tax write-off of that. And then with the tax write-off, what we did is then say, let's route that tax write-off into a life insurance policy. You've given away $5 million to Venus's organization.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You've done a lot of good in the world. But then as well, if you still wanted that money to go to your kids and your grandkids, is get a life insurance policy. Put it in a trust outside of your estate. As long as you live long enough, if you live at least 3 years in most cases, we'll do it. Now that $5 million can transfer to your heirs tax-free. You've given away $5 million that's done a lot of good in the world. We may take that $5 million and then do gift multiplication off of that as well. And now all of a sudden, we may be able to find a way to get 15, 20, 30 million off of that $5 million gift. So always a way to keep stacking and keep compounding it. So that's part of what we would look at there. Question?